In the beginning, there was only earth. Earth and sky and the people who moved between them, hunting and gathering, following seasons and herds, living lives that left almost no permanent mark upon the land. The Paleolithic wanderers who crossed these Anatolian plateaus for tens of thousands of years built no lasting structures, created no monumental architecture, left behind only the faintest traces stone tools scattered across the landscape, occasional cave paintings where ochre still clings to rock walls, burial sites that archaeology sometimes finds and sometimes misses. They moved with the world rather than against it. They adapted to seasons rather than trying to control them. They took what the land offered and left what they could not carry. But something changed, slowly, over generations. The change was not dramatic revolution but gradual shift, the kind of transformation that happens so slowly that no single generation notices it as transformation, that becomes visible only when we stand far enough back to see the before and after with millennia between them. People began to settle, began to stay in one place long enough to call it home, began to plant seeds deliberately rather than simply gathering what grew wild, began to domesticate animals rather than only hunting them, began to build structures that were meant to last not just a season but years, that were meant to shelter not just the immediate family but the extended community, that were meant to mark the landscape as inhabited, as claimed, as transformed by human presence. This was the Neolithic Revolution. The shift from mobile hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. The transformation that would eventually lead to cities and civilizations, and all the complexity that follows when humans stop wandering and start building. But in its early stages, around 8,000 BCE, in the place we now call Central Anatolia, the revolution was still intimate, was still small-scale, was still communities of dozens rather than thousands, was still villages rather than cities, was still the beginning of something whose eventual magnitude no one could have predicted. And with the settling came something else. Something that speaks to the human spirit in ways that transcend mere survival. The people who established the settlement at Köşkhöyük, who chose this particular spot on the plateau and decided to make it permanent home, who built their houses of mud, brick, and stone, who planted their fields and tended their herds, these people also built a shrine. Built a space that was not for sleeping or eating or storing grain or sheltering animals. Built a space whose purpose was not practical but spiritual. Built a room whose architecture declared that some things matter beyond survival, that humans require more than food and shelter, that the invisible demands its own accommodation. The shrine at Köşkhöyük is among the earliest such structures we have found. dates to approximately 6,000 BCE or earlier, predates written language by thousands of years, predates the great religious architectures of later civilizations, the temples of Sumer, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, all of which were still millennia in the future when Köşkhöyük Shrine was built. This was not sophisticated theology made physical, was not complex priesthood performing elaborate ritual, was something simpler and perhaps more profound, was the basic human impulse to mark certain space as sacred, to create threshold between the ordinary and the extraordinary, to give physical form to the sense that there is more to existence than what eyes can see and hands can touch. The stones themselves tell us this. The stones that form the shrine's walls not hewn into perfect blocks, not transported from distant quarries, not shaped with the precision that later architecture would achieve. These are rougher stones, local stones, stones that came from nearby, that were gathered rather than manufactured, that were placed with care but without the mathematical precision that engineering would later demand. The walls they form are thick, are substantial, create enclosure that is real, that separates inside from outside, that makes the shrine space distinct from the domestic spaces that surround it. And the stones are worn, are smoothed in places where 8,000 years of gentle archaeological brushing cannot fully explain the smoothing, are darkened in ways that speak of smoke and time, are marked by the passage of bodies, the leaning of shoulders against walls, the touching of hands to stone, the physical presence of worshippers who came here generation after generation, who stood in this darkness, who breathed this air, who let their bodies rest against these walls while their spirits reached toward whatever they believed dwelt here or could be called here or could be encountered here. We stand at the threshold now, in our imagination, at the entrance to the shrine. The doorway is low, would require bending to enter, would require the physical act of lowering oneself, of becoming smaller, of assuming a posture that is not the upright stance of ordinary movement, but something humbler, something that acknowledges passage from one kind of space into another kind of space. The threshold is worn too, is marked by the feet that crossed it, is darkened by the passage of bodies moving from daylight into shadow, from the village's ordinary life into the shrine's extraordinary purpose. Inside, the darkness is immediate. Not complete in daylight, some light would filter through the doorway, would create a gradient from the entrance's relative brightness to the interior's deeper shadow. But at night, when the shrine would have been used most intensely, when fire would have been the only illumination, the darkness would have been profound, would have been thick, would have been the kind of darkness that makes you aware of your own breathing, that makes you conscious of your heartbeat, that creates intimacy with your own embodiment even as it obscures the physical details of your surroundings. The floor is hard-packed earth, is the same earth that forms the plateau, but compressed by feet, by use, by the pressure of bodies kneeling or standing or prostrating whatever postures prayer took in this place, whatever physical expressions of devotion these people practiced. The floor is marked, shows the traces of the fires that were lit here, shows the stains of offerings that were placed here, shows the disturbance where burials were made beneath the shrine's protection. The ceiling is low, the stone or mud brick forming a roof that creates enclosure, that holds the smoke when fires burn, that contains the prayers when voices speak, that marks the shrine as interior space, as protected space, as womb-like enclosure where something might gestate, where transformation might occur, where the worshipper enters ordinary and emerges perhaps touched by the sacred. Along the walls, niches have been cut or formed, small recesses where objects could be placed, where the clay figurines we will explore later were stationed, where lamps might have burned, where offerings might have been set. The niches create the sense of the walls being not merely barriers but active surfaces, surfaces that participate in the shrine's purpose, that hold and display and present objects to the worshipper's attention, that make the architecture itself part of the ritual rather than merely container for the ritual. And everywhere, the presence of intention. The shrine was not accident, was not natural formation that people simply used, was deliberate construction, was the result of planning and labor and collective decision that this space should exist, that these stones should be gathered and placed, that this threshold should separate sacred from profane, that this darkness should be available for those who needed to stand before mystery and offer whatever offering they brought. What was the first prayer spoken here? We cannot know, cannot reconstruct the language, cannot hear the words. But we can feel the weight of the question, can sense that someone stood here first, stood in this newly constructed darkness, and spoke to whatever presence they believed might listen. Spoke fear or gratitude or petition or praise. Spoke into the darkness and trusted that the darkness might answer. Spoke the first prayer that these stones would witness, that would be followed by thousands more, that would make the shrine alive with human longing, with spiritual hunger, with the persistent need to address the sacred and believe that the sacred might respond. The stone that held the first prayer holds all prayers now, holds them in silence, holds them in the wear and darkening and mark of use, holds them in the memory of the space itself, in the way the shrine continues to be shrine even in ruin, even in abandonment, even in the forgetting that buried it for millennia. The first prayer is lost, but the fact of prayer persists in the stones that remain, persists in our recognition of what this space was and is, persists in the human gesture that created it, the gesture of setting aside space for the holy, of building walls to contain what cannot be contained, of speaking into darkness and trusting that the speaking matters. We stand in the shrine's memory now. Stand where the first worshipper stood. Feel the weight of the stones around us. Feel the darkness that they contain. And we add our own prayer to the layers already present, not prayer for petition, but prayer of recognition, prayer of honor, prayer that acknowledges what these people did when they built this place, when they created this threshold, when they insisted that the sacred deserved its own accommodation, its own darkness, its own stones that would hold the weight of human longing for 8,000 years and counting. The stone holds the prayer still. Will hold it forever. Will testify silently to the human need to worship, to the spiritual hunger that architecture cannot satisfy, but can only acknowledge, can only house, can only mark as real and necessary and worthy of stone and labor, and the setting aside of space that could have been used for practical purposes, but was instead dedicated to mystery, to the invisible, to whatever it was these people believed dwelt just beyond the visible and demanded recognition, demanded offering, demanded the shrine that they built, and that stands in fragments, in archaeological record, in our imagining as testimony to faith's earliest physical form. She appears slowly, emerges from earth that has held her for 8 millennia, emerges grain by grain as the archaeologist's brush moves across soil, as the careful excavation reveals first a curve, then a form, then finally the complete figure clay shaped by human hands into representation of something that mattered enough to be made permanent, to be given form, to be placed in the shrine's darkness, where she would stand witness to prayers we cannot hear and rituals we cannot reconstruct. She is small, fits in a palm, is the size that can be held, can be carried, can be touched, not monumental, not towering, not the grand statuary that later civilizations would create when they wanted to represent divinity, the colossal figures of pharaohs and gods that dominated temple spaces and demanded awe through sheer physical magnitude. She is intimate instead, is human-scaled, is the size of offering, of personal devotion, of the object that accompanies individual prayer rather than commanding collective worship. And she is clearly female. The clay is shaped to emphasize this breasts and hips and belly molded with attention, with intention, with the clear purpose of making femaleness central to whatever this figure represents. The proportions are not realistic, are exaggerated in the way that declares symbolic meaning. The breasts are generous. The hips are wide. The belly is rounded in ways that suggest pregnancy or fertility, or simply the female body's capacity to hold and nurture life. This is not portrait of individual woman, is representation of femaleness itself, of femininity as cosmic principle, of the female as embodiment of creative force. But her face, if she has one, is worn away, or was never clearly defined, or was deliberately left abstract, left featureless, left without the individual identity that a detailed face would provide. Some of the figurines from Köşkhöyük have no faces at all. Some have faces so simplified that they are merely suggestion, the merest indication of eyes or nose or mouth, enough to mark the head as head, but not enough to create personality, not enough to make this figure into this particular goddess, rather than goddess in general, sacred feminine as universal, rather than as specific deity with specific attributes and specific cult. The abstraction is significant, tells us that whatever these people worshipped or revered or acknowledged through these figures, it was not yet the personalized deities of later theology, was not yet the named gods with their specific stories and specific domains and specific relationships to humanity, was something more primal, more fundamental, was the recognition of sacred power in femininity itself, in the female body's capacity to create life, to nurture life, to embody the mysterious transformation from seed to birth, from potential to actual, from invisible to visible. We hold her in museum cases now, behind glass, under labels that try to categorize mother goddess, fertility figure, Neolithic female representation. The labels attempt precision, but cannot capture what she meant to those who made her, cannot reconstruct the prayers addressed to her, cannot hear the names if she had names by which she was called, cannot feel the touch of the hands that shaped her clay, that smoothed her surfaces, that held her while praying, that placed her in the shrine's niches where she would stand in darkness, where lamplight would flicker across her curves, where the sacred feminine presence she represented might manifest, might listen, might respond. The clay itself is local, is the same earth that forms the plateau, that feeds the fields, that provides the material for building, but transformed, worked by hands that understood how to mix and knead and shape, fired in heat that changed the clay's molecular structure, that made it permanent, that transformed soft earth into hard form that would survive millennia. The making of her was itself ritual, perhaps, the shaping of sacred image from ordinary matter, the transformation of earth into goddess. The human hands participating in creation, making manifest through form what belief held as true that the feminine is sacred, that the female body is not merely biological fact but spiritual mystery, that the capacity to create life deserves representation, deserves honor, deserves the labor of making and the dedication of sacred space. At Köşkhöyük, these figurines appear repeatedly. Not just one, not just a single representation, but multiple figures, different sizes, different styles, different degrees of abstraction or detail. The repetition tells us this was not idiosyncratic practice, not individual devotion, but communal pattern. This was how the community represented the sacred feminine. This was shared iconography. This was collective acknowledgement that she, whoever or whatever she was, deserved to be present in the shrine, deserved to be given form, deserved to be encountered through these clay bodies that stood in for her larger, invisible presence. Some of the figurines were broken deliberately, were snapped at the neck or waist. The breaking appears intentional, not the result of accident or decay, but the result of ritual action, of purposeful destruction that was itself part of the religious practice. Was the breaking itself an offering? Was the destruction a way of releasing what the figure contained? Was the fragmentation a ritual of ending, of closing, of completing some cycle that required the goddess's image to be unmade as well as made? We cannot know, can only observe the pattern, can only note that some were broken and that the breaking appears deliberate and that the broken pieces were sometimes buried, were sometimes scattered, were sometimes kept in ways that suggest continued significance even after the wholeness was destroyed. The mystery deepens. The goddess who has no face also has no unbroken body in some cases, is fragmented, is dispersed, is presence that appears only to disappear, that is made manifest only to be deliberately destroyed, that is honored through making and through breaking both. And there is something else. Some of the figurines show wear, show the smoothing that comes from being handled repeatedly, show the touching of fingers, the holding in palms, the carrying as portable sacred object. These were not simply placed and left, were active objects, were handled, were touched, were held in ways that created physical connection between worshipper and representation, between human hand and clay form, between the seeker and the sought, between mortality reaching toward divinity or mystery, or whatever it was these people understood the feminine sacred to be. In the shrine's darkness, she would have been visible only by firelight, would have appeared and disappeared as flames moved, as shadows shifted, as the light source changed position or intensity. The flickering illumination would have animated her, would have made her seem to move, would have created the visual impression of life, of presence, of something more than inert clay resting in stone niche. The play of light and shadow would have been part of her power, would have made her simultaneously present and elusive, simultaneously visible and mysterious, simultaneously object that could be seen and presence that exceeded the visible. We look at her now in steady museum lighting. in the unchanging illumination that allows detailed study, that permits careful photography, that makes possible the academic analysis that categorizes and compares and theorizes. But we have lost the darkness, have lost the firelight, have lost the context of shadows and flickering that would have been her natural element, that would have been how she was meant to be seen, that would have been integral to her power as sacred object. The goddess without a name. The feminine presence that Köşkhöyük's people honored with clay and fire and placement in sacred space. The figure that represents what we can only partially understand, the Neolithic recognition of sacred power in femininity, the devotion to female divinity or female principle or female mystery that appears across cultures and across millennia. That seems to be fundamental human impulse. That creates these representations again and again, even when the specific theologies differ, even when the names change, even when the stories shift. She stands in our imagining now, stands in the shrine's niche. Firelight moves across her curves. Shadows gather in the hollows where her features might be if she had features. And she receives what offerings are brought, witnesses what prayers are spoken, holds in her silent clay the devotion of people whose names we do not know, whose language we cannot reconstruct, whose beliefs we can only infer from the traces they left behind. The goddess without a name, forever nameless, forever faceless, forever testimony to the sacred feminine that predates our theologies, that exists in clay before it exists in text, that is present in the shrine's darkness 8,000 years ago and present still in the question she poses to us: what did they see when they looked at her? What did they hope she would do? What did they believe she represented? The questions have no certain answers. Only the clay remains. Only the form persists. Only the fact of her making and her placement testify to faith we can honor but cannot share, to worship we can study but cannot enter, to the mystery of the goddess who was present enough to deserve representation but remains absent enough that even her name has joined the darkness, has become part of the silence, has left us only form without identity, presence without personality, sacred feminine as eternal question that these clay bodies ask but do not answer. She waits, has been waiting. In museum cases now, in archaeological catalogs, in our imagination, the goddess without a name, forever anonymous, forever mysterious, forever testimony to what the shrine held, and what the shrine holds still: the memory of worship, the trace of devotion, the physical evidence of human longing directed toward the sacred feminine, toward the mystery of creation embodied in female form, toward the goddess who needed no name because her presence was enough, because her form spoke what words were not yet capable of saying. There is a line in the shrine at Köşkhöyük, not a line drawn or painted, not a marker placed intentionally on floor or wall, but a line nonetheless, a boundary, a threshold within the threshold, a division that archaeology reveals through the careful mapping of space, through the notation of where one kind of debris ends and another begins, through the recognition that the shrine area is distinct from the domestic areas not merely in use, but in treatment, in maintenance, in the deliberate separation that architecture enforces. The wall creates this line, not a massive fortification, not a defensive structure meant to keep enemies out or inhabitants in, but an internal partition. A wall within the settlement, a division between spaces that are physically adjacent but functionally separate. On one side, the ordinary life of the Neolithic village, the hearths where food was cooked, the storage areas where grain was kept, the working floors where tools were made and repaired, the domestic debris of daily existence accumulating in layers that archaeology catalogs as evidence of how people lived, what they ate, what implements they used, what patterns of settlement they established. On the other side, the shrine, the sacred space, the area where different rules applied, where different activities occurred, where the archaeological signature is different because the use was different, because this space was not for the mundane necessities of survival, but for the transcendent purposes of worship, for the addressing of mystery, for the performance of rituals that left different kinds of traces, ash from offerings rather than from cooking fires, clay figurines rather than utilitarian pottery, burial goods rather than trash middens. The material evidence of activities that oriented toward the sacred rather than toward the practical. The wall between these spaces is both physical barrier and symbolic statement. As physical barrier, it creates actual separation, prevents casual passage from one area to another, requires intentional crossing, makes movement between spaces into deliberate act rather than unconscious drift. You cannot simply wander from domestic hearth into shrine space, cannot accidentally enter the sacred while going about ordinary tasks. The wall insists on intention, insists that crossing from profane to sacred is choice, is decision, is conscious act that acknowledges what is being left behind and what is being entered. But the wall is also symbolic statement, is declaration that these two modes of existence, the ordinary and the sacred, the profane and the holy, the daily survival tasks and the spiritual practices require separation, that they cannot simply blend. That sacred requires its own territory, its own protected space, its own boundaries that mark it as different, as set apart, as deserving of special treatment and special protection. The wall says that the sacred is not simply aspect of ordinary life, but is distinct realm that must be approached with awareness, with preparation, with the acknowledgement that crossing this threshold means entering different kind of space where different presence might be encountered. The concept seems strange to modern secular sensibility. We are accustomed to sacred and profane intermingling, accustomed to shopping malls and churches existing in same neighborhoods, to moving freely between commercial and religious spaces, to the interpenetration of the sacred and the ordinary that characterizes much of contemporary life. But Köşkhöyük's builders understood something different, understood that the sacred requires enclosure, requires boundary, requires the creation of space that is protected from the contamination of the everyday, that is kept pure through separation, that maintains its power through the very fact of being walled off, of being accessible only through intentional crossing of threshold. The threshold itself becomes important. The doorway in the wall. The opening that allows passage but controls passage, that permits entrance but only through the deliberate act of entering, through the choice to cross, through the physical movement that takes you from one side to the other, from one world to another, from the space of doing to the space of being, from the realm of material necessity to the realm of spiritual encounter. We imagine crossing it. Imagine standing on the domestic side, in the area where ordinary life unfolds, where the hearth smokes and children play and work continues, and the practical demands of existence require constant attention. And then imagine turning toward the shrine, toward the doorway in the wall, toward the darkness that waits beyond. Imagine the physical act of approaching, of reaching the threshold, of pausing there as surely the worshippers paused to acknowledge what is being left and what is being entered, of taking the step that crosses the boundary, that moves from light to shadow, from noise to silence, from the populated space of community to the more solitary space of prayer. The crossing is transformation, even if brief, even if temporary. The wall creates the possibility of transformation by creating the separation that marks one space as different from another. Without the wall, the shrine would simply be corner of larger room, would be area that blended into the domestic space around it, would lack the definite boundary that declares. Here ends the ordinary, here begins the sacred. The wall's construction is simple. Mud, brick, or stone, depending on what materials were readily available, what techniques the builders knew, what local conditions permitted. Not sophisticated architecture, not the precise stonework that later civilizations would perfect, but sufficient, adequate to its purpose, strong enough to create real barrier, tall enough to prevent casual sight lines from domestic area into shrine space, thick enough to create acoustic separation to muffle the sounds of ordinary life, to create within the shrine a quieter atmosphere where prayer could be spoken and heard without competing with the normal noise of settlement life. And the wall endures. Not intact time and weather and the collapse of the settlement have taken their toll, have brought walls down, have turned architecture into archaeology, have transformed standing structure into ground plan revealed only through excavation. But the wall's trace remains in the archaeological record, remains in the line that excavators map, remains in the boundary that still divides the domestic debris field from the shrine area even after millennia of burial. The wall's purpose survives even when the wall's physical form has largely disappeared. The boundary it created persists in the spatial organization that archaeology reveals. Other cultures would develop this principle further, would create elaborate temple complexes where walls within walls created gradations of sacredness, where the journey toward the inner sanctum required passing through multiple thresholds, each marking increased separation from the profane world, each requiring greater purity or greater authorization. Would create the Holy of Holies that only the high priest could enter, that was separated from the rest of the temple by veils and walls, and the understanding that some sacred spaces are too holy for ordinary access, too charged with divine presence to permit casual approach. But Köşkhöyük's single wall already embodies the principle, already declares that the sacred requires its own space, already creates the threshold that must be consciously crossed, already establishes the pattern that later, more complex architectures would elaborate the pattern of separation, of boundary, of the wall that divides worlds not geographically but ontologically, not physically but spiritually, not in measurable distance, but in the qualitative difference between ordinary and extraordinary, between profane and sacred, between the world of doing and the world of being. We stand at the wall now, stand in imagination at the threshold it creates. Stand where the Neolithic worshippers stood when they approached the shrine, when they prepared to cross from one world into another, when they gathered themselves for the transition that the wall both prevented and prevented casual entrance, but permitted intentional crossing, prevented the sacred from being contaminated by the ordinary, but permitted the ordinary to be transformed by encounter with the sacred. The wall that divided worlds. The boundary that created separation and thereby created meaning. The threshold that required conscious crossing and thereby made crossing into ritual act. The architecture that declared some spaces different, some activities special, some moments set apart from the flow of normal time. The wall stands in our understanding now even as it lies in ruins in the archaeological record. stands as testimony to the human need to create boundaries, to mark the sacred as separate, to build walls that protect mystery from profanity, that preserve the holy by keeping it enclosed, that make possible the encounter with transcendence by creating the space where transcendence might manifest. The wall, the threshold, the boundary between worlds, forever dividing, forever connecting, forever the architectural embodiment of the spiritual understanding that the sacred is not everywhere equally, but requires dedication of specific space, specific attention, specific crossing of boundaries that declare, here is different, here is special, here is where the ordinary must be left behind so that the extraordinary might be encountered. The wall, still standing in its absence, still dividing in its disappearance, still creating the threshold we must cross to enter the shrine's mysteries. In the center of the shrine space, archaeologists discovered ash, layer upon layer, accumulated over years, over generations perhaps, over the long span of the shrine's active use. The ash was not uniform, was stratified, showed distinct burning episodes separated by periods of non-use or different use, showed the pattern of fires lit and fires died and fires lit again, showed the residue of combustion repeated so many times that the ash bed became substantial, became feature that had to be maintained, had to be cleaned or spread or periodically removed to prevent it from filling the shrine entirely. But the ash was also unexpected. When analyzed, when subjected to the chemical and microscopic examination that modern archaeology employs, the ash revealed something curious, something that spoke to the shrine's purpose in ways that domestic hearths would not. The ash was not primarily from wood, not from the timber burning that would characterize cooking fires or fires lit for warmth or fires intended simply to provide light. The carbon analysis showed different sources, showed the combustion of materials that domestic fires would not consume. Grain had burned here. Barley and wheat, the domesticated cereals that agriculture had made central to Neolithic life, that represented the stored surplus that allowed settled life to exist. That was the product of months of labor planting and tending and harvesting and thrashing and storing. Grain that could have fed people. Grain that represented wealth in the most fundamental form. Grain that was needed, was valuable, was the difference between survival and starvation in years when harvest failed. This grain had been brought to the shrine and burned, had been removed from the food supply and dedicated to fire, had been transformed from sustenance into smoke. Fat had burned here too. Animal fat perhaps, the rendered tallow from butchered sheep or goats, the fat that could have been eaten or used for light or preserved for later use. Fat that represented calories, That represented the energy that bodies needed to work and move and live. This fat was burned in the shrine, was fed to fires that consumed it completely, that sent it upward as vapor, that transformed solid substance into invisible emanation. Other organic materials appeared in the ash as well, materials that the analysis can identify chemically, but whose specific ritual purpose remains mysterious. Resins, perhaps. Plant materials chosen for their aromatic properties when burned, for the quality of smoke they produced, for scents that were believed to be pleasing to whatever presences the shrine honored. Materials that would not have been abundant, that would have required specific knowledge to gather and prepare, that represented specialized understanding of what should be burned, of what materials created the right kind of smoke, the right kind of offering, the right kind of transformation from matter into mystery. The burning was intentional, was not accident, was not the result of fires that got out of control or spread beyond their intended bounds. Was deliberate combustion of materials that were chosen specifically to be destroyed, to be removed from practical use and dedicated to sacred purpose, to be offered to fire and through fire to whatever the fire was understood to reach, to please, to feed. We imagine the ceremony. Imagine the shrine in darkness. Imagine the worshipper entering with materials for offering, perhaps carried in clay vessels, perhaps held in baskets, perhaps cradled in arms the grain, the fat, the precious resins. Imagine the approach to the ash bed that marks the shrine's center. Imagine the placement of offerings in or near the ash. Imagine the lighting of fire struck from flint perhaps, or carried as ember from domestic hearth and coaxed into flame, or maintained as perpetual fire that never fully died but was always present, always ready to receive what was offered. Imagine the grain beginning to burn, the individual kernels heating and popping perhaps, releasing their moisture as steam, charring and turning to carbon, transforming from food into ash. Imagine the smell not pleasant necessarily, not the comfort scent of baking bread or cooking porridge, but something different, something that marked this burning as different from ordinary burning, as consumption that served purposes beyond hunger. Imagine the fat melting, liquefying in the heat, feeding the flames, creating smoke that was thick and dark, that rose toward the shrine's ceiling and accumulated there, that blackened the stones with deposits that would persist for millennia, that marked the shrine's space as space of burning, space of smoke, space where offerings went upward. Imagine the resins, if resins there were, releasing their aromatic components, creating scents that filled the enclosed space. That would have been overwhelming perhaps in the shrine's small volume. That would have marked the atmosphere as different, as charged, as carrying the physical presence of what had been burned. carrying it as perfume or as incense or as smoke that was meant to please, meant to honor, meant to create bridge between the material offerings and the immaterial recipients. The fire itself was transformation, was the mechanism by which solid became smoke, by which visible became invisible, by which matter passed from this realm into some other realm that the smoke was imagined to reach. Fire was intermediary, was the force that could consume what humans offered and carry it to wherever offerings were meant to go. Was simultaneously destructive, destroying the material substance of what was burned, and creative, creating smoke and heat and light and scent, creating the sensory experience of offering, creating the visible evidence that the ritual was working, that the transformation was occurring, that what was given was being received. The carbon that remains tells us all this and tells us nothing. Tells us what burned in chemical terms the grain, the fat, the organic materials that analysis can identify. But tells us nothing of why, nothing of what the burners believed would happen. Nothing of what prayers they spoke as they placed offerings in fire. Nothing of what presences they imagined were receiving the smoke. Nothing of whether they believed the offerings were feeding gods or appeasing spirits or simply performing duty that tradition required, that community expected, that the shrine's existence demanded. The ash bed grew. Year by year, fire by fire, offering by offering, the accumulation was slow but persistent. Was the physical record of devotion repeated, of ritual performed again and again, of the shrine's central purpose enacted through burning, through the dedication of valuable materials to fire, through the transformation of what could sustain life into what sustained belief. And then the fires stopped. The shrine fell silent. The ash bed grew cold. The final burning occurred without anyone knowing it was final. The last offering was placed. The last fire was lit. The last smoke rose. And then, whether suddenly or gradually, the shrine was abandoned. The fires that had burned for generations went out. The ash that had accumulated remained, waiting in darkness, holding in its chemistry the record of what had burned, holding in its layered structure the evidence of repeated ritual, holding in its presence at the shrine's center the testimony to fire's importance, to burning's centrality, to the offerings that were consumed, and the faith that consumption expressed. We stand at the ash bed now, stand at its trace in archaeological record, stand where fire burned for centuries and where fire has not burned for 8,000 years. Stand at the center of the shrine where offerings rose as smoke, where grain and fat and precious materials were transformed, where the fire that consumed no wood or little wood consumed instead what was valuable, what was needed, what represented surplus and prosperity, and the first fruits that belonged not to the people, but to the sacred, to the mysterious recipients of offerings, to whatever presences the Neolithic worshippers believed inhabited or visited or responded to this shrine, to this darkness, to these fires that burned and finally ceased, leaving only ash to testify to all that was offered, all that was consumed, all that rose as smoke toward sealing stones that still bear the blackening, that still carry the carbon deposits, that still testify to the fires that burned here when the shrine was alive with worship, alive with devotion, alive with the flames that consumed what we needed to consume, that transformed what we needed to transform, that carried our offerings upward in smoke that has long since dispersed but whose memory remains in the ash, remains in the stones, remains in our wondering about what they believed happened when the offerings burned, when the smoke rose, when the fire that consumed no wood consumed instead the grain and fat and precious substances that were too valuable to burn but were burned anyway. Burned because burning mattered, because transformation mattered, because offering mattered more than keeping. Because the sacred deserved the sacrifice, deserved the consumption, deserved the fires that burned at the shrine's center for centuries before falling silent, leaving only ash, only chemical traces, only the blackened stones and our questions about what the fire meant, what the burning accomplished, what rose with the smoke that we can analyze but cannot see, cannot follow, cannot know where it went, or what received it, or whether the offerings reached their intended destination, or simply dissolved into air that has long since circled the planet 1,000 times, carrying nothing of the intention that sent the smoke upward, carrying only carbon molecules that were once grain, once fat, once offerings given to fire in the darkness of the shrine at Köşkhöyük 8,000 years ago. Among the most poignant discoveries at Köşkhöyük are the carbonized seeds, preserved through their own destruction, turned to carbon by fire or by burial in conditions that prevented complete decay. Black now, brittle, small, requiring microscopic examination to identify, but identifiable nonetheless. Barley, wheat, lentils. The domesticated crops that Neolithic agriculture had developed, that represented humanity's transformation from hunter-gatherer to farmer, that made settled life possible, that created the surplus that allowed villages to exist, populations to grow, civilization to begin its long emergence from the nomadic patterns that had characterized human existence for hundreds of thousands of years. The seeds are mundane objects in one sense, are simply grain, simply the stuff of daily bread, simply the material basis of survival in agricultural society. Every household would have had stores of such grain. Every harvest would have produced baskets and jars and storage pits full of these seeds. They were common, were ordinary, were the foundation of the diet that sustained life. But these particular seeds were different, were set apart, were removed from the cycle of consumption and dedicated instead to the shrine. Were brought to sacred space not to be planted, though planting would be return to life, would be investment in future harvest, and not to be eaten, though eating would be fulfillment of grain's purpose, would be the transformation of seed into sustenance, were brought instead to be destroyed, to be burned or buried in ways that removed them permanently from use, to be offered. The offering of grain speaks to multiple understandings. This speaks first to the concept of first fruits, the idea that the earliest or best of the harvest belongs not to the harvesters, but to the sacred powers that made harvest possible, to the forces that controlled rain and sun and soil fertility, to the gods or spirits or cosmic principles that agriculture depended on but could not control. Giving back portion of harvest acknowledged this dependence, acknowledged that humans plant and tend but do not create, do not control the fundamental forces that determine whether grain grows or fails, whether rain comes or drought persists, whether the harvest is abundant or barely sufficient. The offering also speaks to the concept of sacrifice, of giving up what is valuable, of accepting loss for sake of maintaining relationship with the sacred. The grain offered was grain that could not feed anyone, was removed from available food supply. In years of abundance, this might be relatively painless. But in years when harvest was poor, when stores were insufficient, when hunger threatened, the offering would have been genuine sacrifice, would have been choice to give to the sacred even when human need was great, would have been faith expressed through willingness to accept deprivation for sake of honoring obligation to the divine. And the offering speaks to transformation, to the understanding that grain can be more than food, can be symbol, can be currency in spiritual economy, where what matters is not the grain's nutritional value, but its value as offering, as gift, as material expression of gratitude or petition, or simply acknowledgement that the sacred deserves portion of what humans produce, deserves recognition through the giving of something precious, something needed, something whose sacrifice represents real cost. We imagine the offering ritual. Imagine the worshipper selecting grain from household stores. The selection itself might be ritual act, choosing the best kernels, the plumpest seeds, the grain that represents the harvest's highest quality. Or perhaps choosing first portion, the grain that was harvested first, that represented the breaking of the growing season's tension, the relief of knowing that the crops had matured, that food would be available, that another year of survival was secured. Imagine carrying the grain to the shrine, perhaps in clay vessel made specifically for offerings, perhaps in basket woven for this purpose. perhaps simply in cupped hands, the grain heavy in the palm, the kernels smooth and hard, the wheat or barley representing hours of labor, the plowing and planting and weeding and harvesting and thrashing and winnowing that transformed wild grasses into domesticated food, that made agriculture possible, that sustained the community. Imagine the entry into the shrine, the crossing of the threshold, the movement from daylight into shadow, the approach to the ash bed or to whatever location within the shrine was designated for offerings. Imagine the placement. Perhaps the grain was poured into the fire, was fed to flames that would consume it, would transform it into smoke and ash. Or perhaps the grain was buried, was placed in pits beneath the shrine floor where it would remain, where it would slowly carbonize in the soil, where it would be removed from circulation, but preserved in the earth. Imagine the moment of release, the moment when the grain left the worshipper's possession and became offering. The moment when what could have fed became what would not feed. The moment of sacrifice, brief perhaps, unmarked perhaps by any dramatic gesture, but significant nonetheless. The moment when human need yielded to sacred obligation, when survival's imperative was subordinated to worship's requirement. When the grain that never fed became instead prayer made physical, devotion made tangible, faith expressed through the giving up of what was needed, what was valuable, what represented the community's prosperity and the harvest's gift. The agricultural calendar would have shaped this, would have created rhythms of offering tied to planting and harvest. Perhaps offerings when the first seeds were placed in ground, giving back to the earth before taking from it, acknowledging the soil's generosity through dedicating portion of seed that would not grow, but would return to earth as gift rather than as investment. Perhaps offerings at harvest acknowledging success through sharing success, through ensuring that the sacred received portion of what the sacred had enabled. The carbonized seeds that remain are testimony to all this, even though they cannot tell us the specific meanings, the particular theologies, the exact beliefs that motivated the offerings. The seeds are evidence of practice, of ritual repeated, of grain dedicated not to feeding but to offering, of agricultural surplus and perhaps not surplus, perhaps even scarcity's portion being given to the shrine, being removed from human use, being sacrificed in the literal sense of being made sacred, being dedicated to purposes that transcended nutrition. And there is something profound in this, something that speaks to the human capacity to prioritize meaning over survival, to choose symbolic action even when practical concerns press, to insist that life is more than mere continuation, that existence requires not just food and shelter, but meaning and relationship with the sacred, and the performance of rituals that acknowledge our dependence on forces we cannot see or control. The grain that never fed something else, fed the relationship between human and sacred, fed the belief that offerings matter, fed the faith that giving to the divine creates bonds, establishes reciprocity, maintains the cosmic order that allows harvests to succeed, allows life to continue, allows the community to survive not just physically but spiritually, not just as bodies that consume grain, but as souls that require the meaning that comes from dedication, from sacrifice, from offering what is valuable to what is valued, from giving the grain that could feed to the sacred that cannot eat but can receive, can accept, can acknowledge through means we cannot understand but that the Neolithic worshippers trusted absolutely. The seeds rest in collections now, in laboratory trays, in microscope slides, in the careful categorization that archaeology employs to track and study what is found. They are small, are fragmentary, are black carbon that was once golden grain, but they carry weight beyond their physical mass, carry the memory of offering, carry the testimony to agriculture's sacred dimension, to farming as not just technique for producing food, but as participation in cosmic cycle that deserves acknowledgement, that requires giving back, that demands that portion of harvest belong not to harvesters, but to whatever forces make harvest possible. The grain that never fed, the seeds that were offered instead of eaten, the barley and wheat and lentils that went to fire or to earth, or to whatever ritual disposal the shrine employed. All testimony to the human need to offer, to sacrifice, to give what is precious to what is sacred, to trust that the giving matters especially when the giving costs, when the grain that could sustain is instead surrendered, when the seeds that could grow become instead the carbonized testimony to 8,000 years of faith that insisted some grain must never feed, must never be planted, must never serve practical purpose, but must instead be offered, be dedicated, be transformed from food into prayer, from sustenance into sacrifice, from the ordinary grain of survival into the sacred grain of worship. Beneath the shrine floor, mixed with the ash and the offerings, archaeologists discovered fragments of what had once been living creatures. Animal bones, not scattered randomly, not discarded as refuse, but placed with intention, arranged with care, bearing marks that speak of ritual rather than simple consumption, of ceremony rather than casual meal, of death that was transformed into offering, into sacrifice, into the giving of life that accompanied the giving of grain and fat and precious materials. The bones tell stories if we know how to read them. Tell us first what animals died here: sheep primarily, the domesticated flocks that Neolithic Anatolia had learned to manage, that represented wealth and sustenance and the transformation from hunting wild animals to herding tame ones. Goats occasionally. Young animals sometimes, their bones showing the characteristics of youth, of creatures that died before reaching full maturity. The selection was not random, was choice, was decision about which animals would be dedicated to the shrine's purposes, which lives would be given to the sacred. The bones tell us also how the animals died. The cut marks on bone surfaces reveal butchering patterns. But the patterns are different from what we see in domestic refuse areas, are more careful perhaps, are oriented differently, show attention to specific portions of the animal, suggest that the killing and the processing were themselves ritual acts, were performed with consciousness of sacred purpose, were done in ways that acknowledged what was being taken, what was being offered, what transformation was occurring when living creature became offering, when breath ceased and body became gift. Some of the bones show evidence of burning, were placed in or near the shrine's fires, were subjected to heat that charred them, that altered their color and structure, that transformed them from the white or cream color of fresh bone to the black or gray of carbonized material. The burning suggests the bones participated in the offering of fire, were consumed alongside the grain and fat, were part of the smoke that rose toward the shrine's ceiling, were material that was given to flames, and through flames to whatever the flames were understood to reach. Other bones were simply buried, were placed beneath the shrine floor in pits or deposits that seem intentional, were removed from the light and the air and given to the earth. The burial of bones speaks to different theology perhaps, to understanding that earth receives, that soil accepts, that burial is returned to the source from which life emerged. The bones went back to earth, completed the cycle, returned to the darkness from which the animals had been born, to which all flesh eventually returns. We imagine the ceremony of animal sacrifice. Imagine the creature selected perhaps marked somehow as dedicated, perhaps kept separate from the herd for period before its death, perhaps prepared through fasting or special feeding or ritual washing. Imagine the approach to the shrine. The animal would have had to be brought there, led or carried, brought across the threshold from the ordinary village space into the sacred shrine space, brought to the place where its life would end and its transformation would begin. Imagine the killing. Swift, perhaps a single cut that severed major vessels, that allowed blood to flow out, that brought death quickly if not instantaneously. Or slower perhaps methods we cannot fully reconstruct, methods that might have been considered more appropriate for sacred purposes, that might have prolonged the moment of transition from life to death, that might have allowed prayers or invocations to be spoken while the animal's life ebbed away. Imagine the blood. The blood would have been significant, would have been the life force made visible, would have been the liquid that carried existence, that was warm and red and alive until the moment when it was not, when it became stain and memory. Was the blood collected? Was it poured as offering? Was it allowed to soak into the shrine floor, to mark the earth with the evidence of life given, of death accepted, of sacrifice completed? Imagine the butchering, the careful work of separating meat from bone, of dividing the animal into portions, of preparing what would be consumed, for surely some of the meat was eaten, was shared among worshippers or priests or the community, was transformed from sacrifice into sacred meal, into consumption that was itself ritual act, that made the eaters participants in the offering, that created communion between those who shared the flesh of the sacrificed animal. And imagine the bones. After the meat was removed, after the consumption was complete, after the meal or the burning or whatever disposal of flesh the ritual required, the bones remained, could not be eaten, could not be burned completely. Bone resists fire more than flesh does, requires higher heat to fully consume. The bones had to be dealt with, had to be placed somewhere, and the choice was to place them in the shrine, to bury them beneath the floor or to deposit them in the ash bed, or to arrange them in ways that archaeology reveals as patterned, as intentional, as meaningful even when we cannot fully recover the meaning. The animals gave their lives. This is the blunt fact beneath the ritual interpretation. Living creatures breathed their last in service to human belief, died because humans believed their death mattered, their blood had value, their flesh and bones could serve purposes beyond nutrition. The animal sacrifice is disturbing to modern sensibility. We are removed from the killing of our food. We consume meat but rarely witness death. The Neolithic worshippers had no such distance, knew intimately the cost of meat eating, understood that flesh required death. The shrine's animal offerings were not different in kind from the practical butchering that fed the community. Both required the taking of life. But the shrine offerings were different in purpose. Were death given sacred meaning? Were killing transformed into offering? The bones speak also of community, of shared meals that might have followed sacrifice, of the portions of meat distributed to participants, of the eating together that created bonds between those who shared, that made sacrifice communal act rather than individual devotion. The animal killed in the shrine fed the community's spiritual hunger through its death, and fed the community's physical hunger through its flesh. The dual purpose made the sacrifice economically sustainable. The food was not wasted, was consumed, but the consumption was ritualized, was made sacred through the context of offering. And the bones speak of reciprocity, of the understanding that animals were not merely resources to be exploited, but were participants in relationship, were creatures whose lives had value, whose deaths required acknowledgement. The careful burial of bones, the respectful treatment even of what could not be eaten, suggests awareness that taking life incurred debt, created obligation to honor what was taken, to treat remains with care that recognized the animal's sacrifice. The bones are silent now, rest in museum storage, in catalogued boxes, in the careful organization that archaeology imposes on what it finds. They are fragmentary, are incomplete, are scattered pieces rather than whole skeletons. But they testify to the sacred meals, to the animals that died in the shrine's darkness, to the blood that was offered and the flesh that was consumed, and the bones that returned to earth, completing the cycle, returning to soil the mineral components of bodies that had grazed on grasses that grew from that same soil, that had drunk water that fell from sky and seeped through earth, that had been part of the Anatolian landscape's living system before being removed from it through death and dedicated to the shrine's sacred purposes. The bones that returned to earth, that went from soil to grass to sheep to blood to offering to bone to burial to earth again. The cycle complete, the transformation total, the life given and received and honored through the careful treatment of remains, through the burial that acknowledged debt, through the placement in sacred space that declared. This creature's death mattered. This animal's life had meaning. This sacrifice deserves remembrance even if remembrance is only the burial of bones beneath the shrine floor where they would rest for 8,000 years, until archaeology would discover them, would analyze them, would recognize in their patterned placement the evidence of ritual, of ceremony, of faith that understood death as offering, as gift, as necessary cost of maintaining relationship between human and sacred, between the community that needed food and the forces that provided it, between mortality that must take life to sustain life, and the sacred understanding that life taken deserves honor, deserves acknowledgement, deserves the burial of bones, the return to earth, the completion of the cycle that begins in soil and ends in soil, that rises as grass and flesh and blood and prayer, and descends again as bone and ash and memory and silence. Small objects carry disproportionate weight, carry significance that their physical dimensions do not suggest. Among such objects discovered at Köşkhöyük are the stamp seals carved stones small enough to fit in a palm, small enough to be portable, small enough to be easily overlooked, but important enough to be made with care, important enough to be used repeatedly, important enough to survive in the archaeological record as testimony to the human need to mark, to claim, to designate certain things as different from other things, certain spaces as sacred, certain objects as set apart. The seals are simple in construction. Are stones, often soft stones like steatite that can be carved with basic tools shaped into forms that can be held and pressed. Some have flat backs and carved fronts. Some are cylindrical. Some have handles or holes for suspension, suggesting they were worn perhaps, were kept close to the body, were personal objects that accompanied the owner. The carved surface is where the meaning lives. Is negative space carved inward so that when the seal is pressed into soft material, the carved portions remain unstamped while the uncarved areas leave impressions? The result is raised image on the stamped surface, image that appears as if written, as if marked, as if signed. The images on Köşkhöyük seals are geometric primarily, are patterns of lines and spirals and chevrons and crosses, are abstract designs that might represent something concrete, might be stylized versions of natural objects or beings, or might simply be patterns, might be designs chosen for their aesthetic appeal or their symbolic significance, or simply because tradition dictated these were the proper patterns for seals. These were the marks that carried authority, that designated what needed designation. The seal's purpose was marking, was pressing into clay to leave impression. The clay could be the clay that sealed vessels' pottery jars that contained offerings or precious materials, jars that needed to be marked as sealed, as closed, as not to be opened casually. The seal impression on such a vessel declared, "This has been properly closed. This has authority behind its closing. This should not be tampered with." The seal created security through marking, created the visible sign that unauthorized opening could be detected, that violation could be recognized. But in the shrine context, the seals served purposes beyond security, served ritual purposes. The marking of objects designated for sacred use transformed those objects, made them different from ordinary objects. A vessel sealed with shrine seal was not simply closed vessel, was consecrated vessel, was container whose contents belonged to the sacred, whose opening would require proper ritual, proper authority, proper recognition, that what was sealed was not casual possession, but was dedicated, was offering, was removed from profane circulation and placed in sacred category. We imagine the act of sealing. Imagine the vessel filled with grain or oil or whatever substance was being offered. Imagine the clay stopper or cover placed over the vessel's opening. Imagine the soft clay pressed around the seal, creating airtight closure. And then imagine the seal itself removed from wherever it was kept, perhaps from around the neck of the shrine keeper or the ritual specialist, perhaps from a special container where sacred objects were stored. Imagine the seal in hand, the carved surface oriented correctly, the pressure applied that presses the seal into the soft clay of the vessel's stopper. Imagine the moment of pressing. The moment when pattern transfers from stone to clay. When the seal's carved spirals and chevrons leave their impression. When the vessel becomes marked, becomes designated, becomes transformed through the simple act of impression from ordinary container into sacred object, from pottery that could hold anything into pottery that holds offering, from unmarked to marked, from profane to consecrated. The impression remains visible while the clay is soft, shows the clear pattern, shows the seal's authority. And then the clay dries, hardens, becomes permanent. The impression is fixed, cannot be erased without destroying the clay itself. The seal mark becomes testimony that proper procedure was followed, that authority was invoked, that the vessel and its contents were properly dedicated, properly separated from ordinary use, properly designated as belonging to the shrine's sacred category. Some seal impressions at Köşkhöyük appear not on vessels, but on clay that was pressed directly to surfaces, to walls perhaps, to the shrine floor, to architectural elements. These impressions served different purpose, served to mark the space itself, to declare that this area was sealed, was closed, was designated as sacred territory. The seal impression on wall or floor created boundary, created invisible but real division between marked space and unmarked space, between area that was consecrated and area that was ordinary. We think of sealing as protective, as creating barrier that prevents unauthorized access. And this is part of the function. But sealing is also creative, creates category, creates distinction. The sealed vessel is different vessel. The sealed space is different space. The seal mark transforms what it touches, makes the marked thing into sacred thing, makes the ordinary into consecrated, makes the profane into holy through the simple act of impression, through the transfer of pattern from stone to clay, through the visible sign that declares, this is set apart, this is different, this matters in ways that unmarked things do not. The seals were powerful objects despite their small size, held power to transform, held authority to designate, held the capacity to mark boundaries between categories, between sealed and unsealed, between sacred and profane, between what belonged to the shrine and what belonged to ordinary use. The power resided not in the physical seal itself, just carved stone, but in the collective agreement that seal impressions meant something, that they carried authority, that they created real distinctions that must be honored. Who held the seals? Who had authority to use them? We cannot know with certainty. Perhaps specific individuals, shrine keepers, ritual specialists, elders who had responsibility for sacred objects. Perhaps the seals were communal property, were used by whoever performed the sealing rituals regardless of specific individual identity. Perhaps possession of the seal was itself mark of authority, was visible sign that the holder had right to consecrate offerings, to mark sacred space, to create through impression the boundaries that organized Neolithic spiritual life into categories of ordinary and extraordinary, profane and sacred. The seal impressions that survive in the archaeological record are traces of this system, are the visible evidence of marking that occurred 8,000 years ago. The clay has hardened across millennia. The impressions remain visible, the spirals and chevrons and geometric patterns still clear, still readable, still testifying to the moment when wet clay received the seal's pressure, when pattern transferred, when transformation occurred. We hold these small objects in imagination now. Feel their weight in palm. Feel the carved surface beneath fingers. Imagine pressing them into clay. Imagine the resistance of the soft material. Imagine the pattern emerging as the seal is lifted, as the impression is revealed, as the mark appears that will declare this clay different, this vessel consecrated, this space sacred. The seal that marked the threshold, not just physical threshold of doorway, but conceptual threshold between categories, between ways of being, between the ordinary that surrounds us and the sacred that we create through attention, through ritual, through the simple but profound act of marking what matters, of designating what is different, of using small carved stone to press pattern into clay and thereby create boundary, create consecration, create the visible sign that some things are set apart, are dedicated, are sealed with authority that transforms them from what they would be if unmarked into what they become through marking sacred objects, consecrated space, offerings designated for purposes beyond the ordinary, beyond the profane, beyond the everyday circulation of objects and materials and meanings. The seal, the impression, the mark that transforms, forever small, forever significant, forever the carved stone that creates through pressure what prayer creates through speech, the designation of the sacred, the marking of the holy, the visible sign that some things matter differently, that some objects belong to different category, that the shrine's purposes require not just offerings but the marking of offerings, the sealing of what is dedicated, the impression that declares. This is sacred, this is set apart, this belongs to the mystery that the shrine houses and honors and protects. Red appears throughout the shrine, not everywhere, not uniformly, but persistently. Red ochre iron oxide ground to powder, mixed with liquid to create paint, applied to surfaces that would hold the color, that would testify through their redness to human intention, to symbolic thinking, to the understanding that color carries meaning, that hue can transform, that the application of pigment can make ordinary surfaces into sacred surfaces, can designate what is marked as different from what is unmarked. Ochre is Earth's blood, is the color of life, of the liquid that flows through veins, of the substance that reddens cheeks and lips, of the evidence that bodies are alive, that hearts beat, that circulation continues. Red is the color of vitality, of energy, of the life force made visible through hue. Humans have recognized this for hundreds of thousands of years, have used ochre in ritual contexts since the Paleolithic, have buried their dead with ochre powder, have painted cave walls with ochre images, have marked their own bodies with ochre designs that declared identity, that showed affiliation, that transformed skin into canvas for symbolic communication. At Köşkhöyük, the ochre appears on walls, on plaster surfaces that were deliberately prepared to receive color. The red is not accidental spillage, is not the result of ochre powder being stored nearby and inadvertently staining surfaces. The distribution is patterned, shows areas of concentration, shows places where red was applied with intention, where walls were marked with color that would catch light, that would create visual emphasis, that would make certain areas of the shrine visibly different from other areas. We imagine the preparation. Ochre does not come ready to use, must be collected, found in deposits where iron-rich soil has oxidized, where the earth itself has turned red through geological processes that concentrate iron oxide, must be gathered, must be ground. The grinding is labor, stone against stone, crushing the ochre lumps into powder fine enough to mix with liquid, fine enough to create paint that will spread smoothly, that will adhere to surfaces, that will dry to permanent color rather than simply flaking away. Imagine the grinding, the repetitive motion, the gradual transformation of chunks into powder, the red dust staining hands and tools and clothes, the color accumulating. The physical evidence of work devoted to creating pigment, to making color available, to preparing material that will transform shrine walls from neutral plaster into marked surfaces, into areas designated through redness as special, as different as sacred. The mixing requires judgment. Too much liquid and the ochre becomes watery, becomes translucent, becomes inadequate for creating strong color. Too little and the mixture is paste, is difficult to apply, is too thick to spread evenly. The proper consistency is learned through experience, through trial and error, through the accumulated knowledge of those who have prepared ochre before, who know how it should look, how it should feel, how it should behave when applied to plaster surfaces. And then the application. Perhaps with fingers the most direct method, the most immediate contact between color and surface. Perhaps with brushes made from plant fibers or animal hair. perhaps with cloths or pads that could spread the ochre more evenly than fingers alone. The method mattered less than the result surfaces marked with red, walls transformed through color, shrine space, made visibly different through the application of pigment that carried symbolic weight. The red would have glowed in firelight, would have caught the flame's movement, would have appeared to pulse perhaps, to breathe, to be alive with the reflected light that moved across the colored surfaces as fires burned in the shrine's darkness. The interplay between red ochre and firelight would have created atmospheric effect impossible to fully reconstruct, but crucial to the shrine's experiential reality. The walls were not simply red, but were dynamically red, were color that moved and shifted and changed as light sources moved, as flames guttered or flared, as worshippers moved between the light and the walls, creating shadows that revealed and concealed the painted surfaces. But the ochre appears not just on walls, appears also in association with burials. The dead at Köşkhöyük were sometimes accompanied by ochre, sometimes sprinkled with the red powder, sometimes laid on beds of ochre, sometimes marked with ochre in ways that cannot be fully determined from skeletal remains, but that chemical analysis reveals the red was present, was deliberately placed, was part of the burial ritual that accompanied the dead into the earth. The association of ochre with death is ancient, is pattern that appears across cultures and across millennia. The red is life's color used to mark death, is the paradox of painting the lifeless with the color of vitality, is the suggestion perhaps that death is not ending but transformation, that the color of life accompanies the dead because life continues in some form, that the red marks the body as still connected to the living force even when breath has ceased, even when the body is cold, even when decay has begun. Or perhaps the ochre served different purpose, served as protection, as marker that declared the dead as deserving of respect, as under sacred protection, as not to be disturbed. The red marked boundaries around the burial, created visible sign that this earth was different, was consecrated, was removed from ordinary use because it contained the dead who belonged now to the shrine's sacred category, who had crossed the threshold between life and death and deserved the marking that acknowledged their transformation. We imagine the burial accompanied by ochre. Imagine the body prepared. Imagine the grave dug beneath the shrine floor or in the earth surrounding the shrine. Imagine the ochre brought in vessels or bags. Imagine the powder sprinkled over the body before earth was replaced. Imagine the red staining the burial shroud if shroud there was. Imagine the color mixing with soil as earth was returned to the grave, as the burial was sealed, as the dead were given to the earth that would hold them, and to the ochre that would mark them, that would testify to their sacred status. that would create through color what ritual created through ceremony, the transformation of the dead from merely deceased into honored ancestors, into those who deserved the expensive pigment, into those whose graves would bear the red mark that declared them special, different, sacred. The ochre that remains now is faded, is diminished, is pale shadow of what it would have been when fresh. 8,000 years of burial have leached the color, have oxidized the iron further, have transformed the vivid red into rusty brown. But chemical analysis reveals what eyes cannot see, reveals the iron oxide signature, reveals that red was present, reveals the pattern of application even when the color itself has faded below visual detection. And we understand through this that the shrine was not colorless space, was not neutral environment, was marked environment, was space where red appeared on walls and in burials, where color designated what mattered, where ochre transformed surfaces from unmarked to marked, from ordinary to sacred, where the application of earth's blood created visual prayers, created color that carried meaning, created the painted surfaces that testified to human understanding that significance requires marking, that the sacred deserves color, that red life's color, blood's color, ochre's ancient color belongs in the shrine's darkness, belongs on the walls and in the graves, belongs as physical prayer, as painted devotion, as the color that transforms what it touches, that makes the painted wall into sacred wall, that makes the ochre-marked burial into honored burial, that creates through simple application of ground earth mixed with water the visual testimony that color matters, that hue carries meaning. That red is not just red, but is life and blood and sacred and transformation, and all the accumulated symbolic weight that humans have given this color for hundreds of thousands of years. That the Neolithic worshippers at Köşkhöyük continued when they ground their ochre and mixed their paint and marked their shrine walls and honored their dead with the red that remains, faded now but still present, still testifying to the prayers that were painted, to the devotion that was colored, and to the shrine that was marked with earth's blood, with iron's red, with ochre's ancient and eternal testimony to life and death, and the sacred that encompasses both. Beneath the shrine floor, mixed with the ash and the offerings, archaeologists discovered human remains. Not many, not the extensive cemeteries that would characterize later periods, but present, deliberate, placed with care. The dead at Köşkhöyük were given to the shrine's protection, were buried in sacred space, were laid to rest where prayers rose and offerings burned and the community encountered mystery. The placement was not accident, was choice, was decision that these particular individuals would sleep their final sleep, not in ordinary burial ground, but within or immediately adjacent to the sacred structure, that they would remain proximate to the shrine's rituals, that death would not separate them from the community's spiritual center. The burials show care, show attention to positioning. The bodies were flexed knees drawn toward chest, arms folded, the fetal position that appears in Neolithic burials across many cultures. That suggests perhaps the understanding of death as return to womb, as preparation for rebirth, as sleep that mirrors the position of unborn life waiting to emerge. The positioning required effort, required handling of the dead, required physical contact with bodies that were beginning the process of decay, that were no longer living persons, but were not yet simply remains, that were in the liminal state between death and dissolution. We imagine the burial ceremony. Imagine the death occurring. Imagine the community's response the morning, the preparation of the body, the decisions about where and how the dead would be laid to rest. For those who would be buried in the shrine, additional decisions were required. The shrine's floor would have to be disturbed. The earth beneath would have to be excavated. The grave would have to be prepared within sacred space, creating temporary disruption of the shrine's normal function, requiring that worship activities accommodate the burial, that the sacred space open itself to receive the dead. Imagine the body carried to the shrine, carried across the threshold that the living crossed for worship, but that this person would cross only once more, would cross as deceased rather than as worshipper, would cross to enter the shrine permanently, to become part of the shrine's permanent population, to join the dead who already rested there, and who would be joined by others in turn as the shrine's active life continued, as more deaths occurred, as more individuals were deemed worthy of burial in sacred space. Imagine the placement in the grave, the lowering of the body, the positioning, careful arrangement of limbs, orientation of the body to face certain direction. The burials show preferences, show patterns that suggest cosmological orientation, suggest that facing mattered, that direction had meaning even in death. The objects placed with the dead pottery vessels that might contain food or drink for the journey, tools that might be needed in afterlife, or that simply proclaimed the deceased's identity and status, precious items that showed the community's willingness to part with valuable objects to honor the dead, to ensure they were properly equipped for whatever existence followed death. And then the earth returned, the grave filled, the soil replaced carefully or quickly depending on what ritual required, the shrine floor restored, the burial completed, the dead now residing beneath the space where the living would continue to worship, where fires would continue to burn, where offerings would continue to be made. The dead becoming permanent presence in the shrine, becoming part of the sacred space's reality, becoming witnesses to all that would occur in the shrine during the years or generations before the shrine itself was abandoned, before the dead would be left undisturbed, before 8,000 years would pass with the bodies resting in the earth that held them, in the shrine's darkness that had become their permanent darkness. The burial in sacred space speaks to cosmology, to beliefs about death and afterlife, to understanding that the dead require proximity to the sacred, that placing them near the shrine benefits them in some way, that death is not absolute separation from community or from spiritual life, but is transformation that requires ongoing relationship, requires the living to maintain connection, requires the dead to remain present even in their absence. Or perhaps the burial speaks to honor, to recognition that certain individuals deserved special treatment, that their status or their achievements or their spiritual significance meant they should rest in sacred ground rather than in ordinary burial area. That being laid beneath the shrine was privilege, was mark of esteem, was the community's way of declaring that this person mattered, that their death deserved extraordinary acknowledgement, that their memory would be preserved through proximity to the shrine's perpetual rituals. The bodies themselves tell limited stories now. Our skeletons, our bones divorced from the flesh and identity that made them persons. The archaeological analysis can determine age at death. Some were old by Neolithic standards. Some were young. Some were children whose short lives ended before they could know the world beyond Köşkhöyük. Can determine sex, male and female both appear among the burials, suggest that sacred burial was not limited to one gender. Can determine some aspects of health and disease. The bones bear marks of lives lived, of illnesses endured, of injuries sustained. But the bones cannot tell us who they were as people, cannot tell us their names or their personalities or their roles in the community, cannot tell us why they specifically were chosen for burial in the shrine, cannot tell us what they believed would happen after death, what they hoped for, what they feared, what comfort they took, if any, in knowing they would rest in sacred space. We sit with the silence of the burials, sit with the gaps in knowledge, sit with the recognition that these were people who lived and died, and were laid to rest by others who mourned them, who prepared their bodies, who dug their graves, who placed them in the shrine's earth and covered them and continued living, continued worshipping in the shrine above where the dead rested below, continued the daily and seasonal rhythms of Neolithic life, while the dead remained as permanent residents of the sacred space, remained as the still and silent presence beneath the active shrine. And we understand that the shrine was not just space for the living, was not just place where the living encountered the sacred, was also home to the dead, was place where mortality was acknowledged and honored, was space where the boundary between life and death was thin, where the dead remained present to the living through proximity, where burial in sacred earth created ongoing relationship between those who walked above and those who slept below, between the community that continued and the individuals whose continuation had ended, between the prayers that rose and the bodies that rested, between the offerings that burned and the dead who witnessed in whatever way the dead witness. In whatever form consciousness takes after breath ceases, in whatever existence follows the body's failure, the sleep that never woke, the final rest in sacred earth, the burials that placed the dead at the shrine's foundation, that made mortality part of the sacred space's reality, that acknowledged through placement that death belongs in the shrine too, that the sacred encompasses not just life but death, not just vitality but cessation, not just the prayers of the living but the silence of the dead who rest beneath, who sleep their final sleep in the shrine's darkness, who remain forever in sacred space, forever part of the shrine's population, forever testimony to the Neolithic understanding that the dead deserve proximity to mystery, that burial in sacred ground honors both the deceased and the shrine that receives them, that death is not simply end, but is transformation that requires sacred acknowledgement, requires burial in hallowed earth, requires the shrine to open itself to receive the dead, and to hold them, to protect them, to keep them in the darkness that the living entered for worship, but that the dead entered permanently, entering the sleep that never woke, the rest that has lasted 8,000 years, the silence that continues while the shrine has long since fallen quiet, while the worshippers have long since ceased, while the dead alone remain in the earth that has held them, remain in the shrine that has crumbled above them, remain as the silent testimony to lives lived and deaths mourned, and burials performed with care in the sacred space at Köşkhöyük, where the dead still sleep their ancient sleep. The shrine at Köşkhöyük did not end dramatically, did not fall to conquest or burn in catastrophe or collapse in earthquake, did not experience the violent terminus that archaeology sometimes discovers the destruction layers that speak of war or fire or natural disaster, the sudden endings that freeze moments in time, that preserve the last activities in the abrupt cessation of abandonment forced by crisis. Instead, the shrine fell silent gradually, quietly. The way things end when they simply cease to matter, when the need they filled no longer exists, when the community that maintained them moves on or changes, or simply loses the commitment that had sustained the shrine's activities for generations. The silence accumulated slowly. The fires burned less frequently. The offerings decreased. The threshold was crossed less often. The shrine's rituals continued, but with diminishing intensity, with less fervor, with the sense perhaps that what had once been essential had become optional, that what had demanded regular attention could be neglected, that the sacred space could be left empty without catastrophe, without divine retribution, without the cosmic disruption that abandoning the shrine might have been feared to cause. We cannot know what caused the change, cannot know whether it was gradual shift in beliefs, new understanding of the sacred that did not require shrines, new religious forms that superseded the old practices. Cannot know whether it was population movement, the community leaving Köşkhöyük for new settlement, migrating to different location, dispersing in ways that meant the shrine lost its congregation, lost the people who had maintained it. Cannot know whether it was economic change shifts in subsistence patterns that made the surplus offerings unsustainable, that transformed a community that could dedicate grain and animals to sacred purposes into a community struggling to survive, unable to spare resources for worship. Or perhaps the silence came simply from time's slow erosion of commitment, from the gradual cooling of religious fervor that can occur across generations. The founders build with passion. Their children maintain with duty. Their children's children perform with habit, and eventually the habit fades. Eventually the shrine becomes simply old building, its purposes forgotten or made irrelevant by new concerns, its sacred status diminished to nostalgia or memory or simply indifference. The archaeological record shows the transition, shows the layers of diminishing activity, shows the ash beds that stop accumulating, shows the debris that suggests the shrine space began to be used for storage rather than worship, began to hold ordinary objects rather than sacred ones, began to transform from dedicated religious space into simple room, into structure that happened to exist and could be useful for purposes unrelated to the purposes for which it was built. And then the final abandonment. The moment, if moment it was, rather than gradual process when the shrine was entered for the last time. When the last offerings were placed, when the last prayers were spoken, when the threshold was crossed for the final occasion by living worshipper, when the shrine became simply empty space, became building without function, became architecture that would slowly begin its collapse, would gradually yield to weather and time, and the inevitable dissolution of structures unmaintained. We imagine that last entrance. Imagine someone crossing the threshold, perhaps knowing it was the last time, perhaps not knowing, perhaps simply expecting to return but never returning, perhaps intending to come back tomorrow or next week or next season but finding reasons to delay, finding that the return became less urgent, became eventually unnecessary, became forgotten as life's other demands took precedence over the shrine's quiet call. Or perhaps there was ceremony of closure. Perhaps the community gathered. Perhaps there were final rituals. Perhaps the shrine was formally decommissioned, was released from its sacred purposes through ritual acts that declared its work complete, its function fulfilled, its time ended. Perhaps the goddess figurines were removed. Perhaps the sacred objects were taken away or deliberately buried. Perhaps the threshold was sealed. Perhaps the doorway was blocked. Perhaps measures were taken to mark the shrine as closed, as no longer active, as transitioned from living religious space to memorial space to simply space that had once been sacred but was sacred no longer. We do not know. The archaeology preserves the fact of abandonment but not the manner of it, preserves the silence but not the transition to silence, preserves the empty shrine but not the last moments when it was full, when it functioned, when it lived with the worship that had sustained it for centuries. And after the abandonment, the accumulation began. The slow accumulation of soil, of wind-blown dust, of organic material decomposing, of the earth gradually covering what humans had left exposed. The shrine's walls began to collapse. The roof fell in. The interior filled with debris. The structure transformed from building into mound, from architecture into gentle rise in the landscape, from shrine into hill that appeared natural, that bore no obvious sign of human construction, that became simply feature of the plateau's topography. The forgetting was complete. The shrine that had been known to every member of the community, that had been central to their spiritual lives, that had been the place where mystery was encountered, and offerings were made, and the dead were buried, this shrine was forgotten, was erased from memory, was lost not through violent destruction, but through the simple passage of time, through the mortality of those who remembered, through the failure to transmit knowledge to next generation, through the silence that replaced the songs, that replaced the prayers, that replaced the words that had been spoken in the shrine's darkness. For thousands of years, the shrine rested unknown, rested beneath accumulating soil, rested while civilizations rose and fell elsewhere, while writing was invented, and cities were built, and empires expanded, and religions developed theologies far more complex than anything the Köşkhöyük worshippers had known. Rested while the world changed in ways that would have been incomprehensible to those who built the shrine, who worshipped there, who were buried there. Rested while human knowledge expanded, and human population grew, and human technology transformed what was possible. Rested in silence, in darkness, in the complete forgetting that is more absolute than any destruction. And then in the late 20th century, the silence was broken. Archaeologists came. Surveys were conducted. The mound was recognized as potentially human-made. Excavations began. The shrine was discovered. The walls were revealed. The ash beds were found. The figurines were uncovered. The burials were exposed. The shrine returned to human knowledge not as continuity, but as rupture, as discontinuous fragment, as message from the past that arrived without context, without the living tradition that would explain it, without the songs that had been sung there, or the prayers that had been spoken, or the beliefs that had sustained it. The silence that replaced song. The forgetting that replaced memory. The abandonment that transformed living shrine into archaeological site, into object of study rather than center of worship, into evidence rather than experience. The transformation is complete, is irreversible. We can excavate the shrine but cannot resurrect it, can study its remains but cannot hear its music, can analyze its offerings but cannot feel the faith that made offering necessary, that made sacrifice meaningful, that made the shrine essential to those who built and maintained and eventually abandoned it. The silence holds everything, holds the songs we cannot hear, holds the prayers we cannot recover, holds the beliefs we cannot share, holds the lived reality of worship that the material remains can only suggest, can only point toward, can only make us aware that we are missing, that we have lost, that the silence has taken and will not return. And we stand in this silence now. Stand in the recognition that the shrine is simultaneously present and absent, present in its physical remains, absent in its living function, present in what archaeology reveals, absent in what archaeology cannot recover, present as object, absent as experience, present in the fragments that survive, absent in the wholeness that is gone, that the silence has claimed, that rests now in the unrecoverable past where the songs were sung, and the prayers were spoken, and the shrine was alive with worship before the silence came, before the songs ceased, before the abandonment transformed living sacred space into the ruins that archaeology studies and we contemplate, wondering about the silence, wondering what was lost, wondering if the shrine misses the songs, if the walls remember the prayers, if the earth recalls the offerings, if silence itself is a kind of memory, a kind of testimony to what was present and is present no longer, to what was sung and is sung no more, to the shrine that lived and died and waits in silence for us to acknowledge what the silence holds. We stand at the edge of understanding, stand at the boundary between what we can know and what we can only imagine. The shrine at Köşkhöyük has revealed its material traces, has given to careful excavation its stones and ash and bones and seeds and figurines and seal impressions and ochre stains. has surrendered to archaeological analysis the physical evidence of 8,000 years ago, has allowed itself to be measured and mapped and photographed and catalogued, has become data, has become record, has become the subject of scholarly papers and museum displays and educational materials. But the shrine retains its mystery, retains everything that physical evidence cannot capture, retains the lived experience of worship, retains the emotional reality of faith, retains the subjective dimensions of belief that motivated the shrine's construction and sustained its use for generations, and finally faded in the abandonment that left only ruins for us to find. What did it feel like to worship there? What emotional states did the shrine's darkness and firelight and ash and offerings create in those who entered? What sense of sacred presence, if any, did the worshippers experience? What comfort or fear or awe or gratitude or petition or hope or despair brought them across the threshold into the shrine's enclosure? The questions have no certain answers, cannot be answered through archaeology alone, cannot be reconstructed from material remains no matter how carefully analyzed. We can describe the shrine's architecture, can detail its spatial organization, can list the artifacts found within it, can analyze the chemical composition of offerings, can determine the age and sex and health status of those buried beneath its floor, can map the distribution of ash and ochre and seal impressions, can create detailed documentation of everything that survives physically. But we cannot enter the shrine as it was experienced, cannot cross the threshold with the mindset of Neolithic worshipper, cannot see the goddess figurines with the eyes of those who made them and believed in them, cannot feel the significance that the grain offerings held for those who brought them, cannot participate in the emotional reality of sacrifice, cannot share the grief of burial or the hope of continuity or the faith in sacred presence that the shrine embodied. The gap is absolute, is uncrossable. Time creates division that no scholarship can fully bridge. We are separated from the Neolithic worshippers not just by 8,000 years, but by the totality of human experience accumulated in those millennia. By writing and agriculture and metallurgy and urbanization, and empire and science and technology and philosophy and theology, and all the accumulated changes that have transformed human consciousness, human society, human understanding of the sacred and the profane. We cannot think like Neolithic people, cannot share their worldview, cannot inhabit their cosmology, can only observe from vast distance, can only interpret through frameworks they would not recognize, can only translate their practices into our categories, knowing that the translation loses what is most essential, what is most immediate, what is most real about their experience. And yet we try. We try because the shrine calls to us, calls across the millennia, calls through the mystery of human faith that persists even when its forms change. We recognize in the shrine's ruins something familiar. Recognize the human impulse to create sacred space. Recognize the need to mark boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary. Recognize the practice of offering as expression of relationship with what transcends. Recognize burial as honoring of dead and hope for continuity. Recognize all these human gestures that appear across cultures and across time, that seem to be fundamental to human nature, that connect us to the Neolithic worshippers even as vast differences separate us. The shrine is returning to dust. The archaeological investigation is complete. The excavations are closed. The site is covered again, protected from further exposure to weather and erosion. The artifacts are in museums and storage facilities. The documentation is in archives. The shrine itself is again beneath the earth, again in darkness, again in the condition that preserved it for 8 millennia before archaeology discovered it. And the shrine is entering dream, is entering the realm of imagination where it lives now more vividly perhaps than it lives in the covered ruins or the catalogued artifacts. Is entering our consciousness as symbol, as image, as touchstone for contemplating the sacred, as embodiment of human spiritual hunger, as testimony to the endurance of faith across unimaginable spans of time. In our dreams, the shrine is whole. The walls stand. The roof shelters. The fires burn. The goddess figurines watch from their niches. The offerings are placed. The prayers are spoken. The dead rest peacefully beneath the floor. The shrine is alive with worship. Is functioning as it functioned 8,000 years ago. Is present not as ruin but as living sacred space. In our dreams, we can cross the threshold, can enter the darkness, can stand where the Neolithic worshippers stood, can witness the ceremonies, can hear the songs, can feel the heat of the fires, can smell the burning offerings, can see the ochre glowing in firelight, can touch the goddess figurines, can participate in imagination in the worship that the material remains can only suggest. The dream is not archaeology, is not scholarship, is not accurate reconstruction, is something else, is human consciousness reaching across time toward other human consciousness. Is the attempt to honor what cannot be fully known by imagining it as best we can, by giving it life in our minds, by refusing to let the shrine exist only as catalog of artifacts and measurements and chemical analyses. The return to dust is physical fact. The shrine is buried again. The site is protected. The investigation is concluded. The physical shrine has given what it can give, has yielded its material testimony, has allowed its bones and ash and stones to speak the limited language that physical objects speak. But the return to dream is ongoing, is the work we must continue. is the honoring of the shrine through contemplation, through wonder, through the acknowledgement that 8,000 years ago people created sacred space that mattered to them, that shaped their lives, that connected them to mystery, that deserves our attention not just as archaeological evidence, but as testimony to human spiritual capacity, to the endurance of faith, to the persistent need to worship that the shrine embodies in its crumbling walls and its silent ashes. We close our eyes and see the shrine, see it whole, see it alive, see it functioning as center of Neolithic spiritual life, see the worshippers bringing their offerings, see the fires burning, see the goddess standing watch, see the dead sleeping beneath, see the shrine as it was before the silence, before the abandonment, before the forgetting, before the 8,000 years that separate us from them. And in seeing, we honor their faith, we honor their work, we honor their dedication of resources and labor and devotion to the creation of sacred space. We honor the shrine itself, the architecture and the offerings and the burials and all the human gestures that made it holy, that marked it as different, that created the threshold between ordinary and extraordinary. The shrine returns to dust and dream, returns to the earth that holds it physically and to the imagination that holds it spiritually, returns to the silence of ruins and to the life of contemplation, returns to being object and to being symbol, returns to material trace and to mystery, returns to what archaeology can study and to what only reverence can approach. And we remain at the threshold, remain at the boundary we cannot cross, remain in the present looking toward the past, remain as witnesses to what survives and as mourners for what is lost. Remain as students of the material and as dreamers of the immaterial. Remain as inheritors of the shrine's physical traces and as guardians of the shrine's memory. Remain standing where the threshold once was, where the doorway opened into sacred darkness, where the Neolithic worshippers crossed from their world into the shrine's enclosure, where we can approach but cannot enter, where we can honor but cannot share, where the shrine waits in its return to dust and dream, waiting in the earth, waiting in our imagination, waiting in the silence that holds everything the shrine was and everything we wish we could know, everything that survives and everything that is lost, everything that dust preserves and everything that dream restores. At the edge of all our knowing stands a final barrier, not physical wall, not locked door, not forbidden territory guarded by authority that could grant or deny access, but the absolute threshold that time creates, the uncrossable boundary between past and present, the division that separates us eternally from the lived experience of the Neolithic worshippers at Köşkhöyük. We can excavate their shrine, can analyze their offerings, can study their bones, can catalog their artifacts, can measure their architecture, can map their settlement, can employ every tool of modern archaeology and every method of scientific analysis, can accumulate data and generate hypotheses and construct interpretations, can build detailed understanding of the physical traces they left behind. But we cannot cross into their world, cannot enter their consciousness, cannot share their faith, cannot feel what they felt when they approached the shrine in darkness, cannot think their thoughts as they placed offerings in fire, cannot experience the significance that the goddess figurines held for them, cannot grieve as they grieved when they buried their dead beneath the shrine floor, cannot believe as they believed in whatever sacred presences they imagined or experienced or related to through their rituals. The barrier is epistemological, is the fundamental limit of historical knowledge. We can know what people did, can reconstruct actions and practices and behaviors from physical evidence. But we cannot know what those actions meant to those who performed them, cannot access the subjective experience, cannot enter the interior reality, cannot share the consciousness that animated the practices we can observe only from outside, only through the traces that survive, only through the mediation of centuries and scholarly interpretation, and our own inevitably anachronistic frameworks. We stand at this threshold and must acknowledge it, must accept that despite our best efforts, despite the most sophisticated analysis, despite the deepest engagement with the evidence, we remain outside, remain as observers of a past we cannot enter, remain as interpreters of meanings we cannot fully recover, remain as inheritors of material traces disconnected from the living contexts that gave them significance. The acknowledgement is not defeat, is not admission that scholarship is futile or that archaeology has failed, is simply recognition of limitation, recognition that knowing has boundaries, that understanding has limits, that some things are lost beyond recovery, that time's passage creates gaps that cannot be bridged by any methodology, no matter how rigorous, no matter how innovative, no matter how dedicated the attempt. And yet we stand at the threshold anyway, stand at the boundary we cannot cross but cannot ignore. Stand in the recognition that the shrine matters despite being inaccessible, that the Neolithic worshippers' faith matters despite being unrecoverable, that the 8,000 years of separation matter less than the human connection we feel across them. We are drawn to the threshold, are drawn to the mystery of other human lives, lived in contexts so different from our own that imagination struggles to reconstruct them, are drawn to the shrine because it testifies to human capacities that persist, the capacity for faith, for devotion, for creating sacred space, for offering sacrifice, for maintaining ritual across generations, for believing that the invisible is real, that the sacred exists, that worship matters. The threshold we cannot cross becomes itself sacred, becomes the boundary that reminds us of mystery, that insists we acknowledge what we do not know, that prevents us from claiming certainty we do not possess, that creates the space where scholarship becomes humility, where interpretation becomes wonder, where analysis becomes contemplation. We honor the threshold by standing at it, by not pretending we can cross it, by not claiming access we do not have, by accepting that the Neolithic worshippers remain other, remain different, remain separated from us by time's uncrossable gulf. And by honoring them precisely in their otherness, in their difference, in their inhabiting of world we cannot enter, in their faith we cannot share. The shrine waits on the other side, waits in the past we cannot visit, waits alive with worship we cannot witness, waits as it was before the silence, before the abandonment, before the burial that preserved it, before the discovery that revealed it, waits in its full functioning reality that we can imagine but cannot experience, waits with its fires burning and its offerings being placed, and its prayers being spoken, and its goddess figurines watching from niches, and its dead sleeping beneath, and its worshippers crossing the threshold from the village into the sacred darkness. And we wait on this side, wait in the present, wait with the ruins and the artifacts and the scholarly interpretations and the catalogued data. Wait with everything that survives physically and nothing that survives experientially. Wait with the knowledge we can accumulate and the knowledge we can never possess. Wait at the threshold that separates investigation from participation, observation from immersion, analysis from experience. The waiting is itself prayer, is itself offering, is itself the acknowledgement that the shrine deserves our attention, our respect, our wonder, our recognition that 8,000 years ago humans created sacred space that mattered to them, and that matters to us precisely because it mattered to them, precisely because their faith was real to them, precisely because the shrine was not archaeological site but living religious center, not object of study but place of worship, not past to be analyzed but present to be lived. We cannot cross the threshold, but we can stand at it, can honor it, can acknowledge what it represents, the boundary between what we can know and what remains forever mysterious, between the physical traces we possess and the lived experiences we cannot recover, between the shrine as ruin and the shrine as sacred space, between the Neolithic worshippers who inhabited their faith and we who can only observe its traces. The threshold remains, will always remain, is the permanent condition of our relationship to the past, is the uncrossable boundary that makes history both possible and incomplete. Possible because physical traces survive, because archaeology can reconstruct actions, because scholarship can interpret evidence. Incomplete because subjective experience does not survive, because consciousness leaves no archaeological signature, because faith cannot be excavated or analyzed or definitively interpreted. And in this incompleteness lies the shrine's final teaching. Teaches us humility, teaches us that knowing has limits, teaches us that mystery is not simply unsolved puzzle, but is permanent feature of human encounter with the past. Teaches us that the sacred, whether the Neolithic sacred that the shrine housed, or the sacred dimension of historical inquiry itself, requires reverence that acknowledges what cannot be possessed, that honors what cannot be fully known, that stands at thresholds that cannot be crossed and finds meaning in the standing, in the honoring, in the acknowledgement of mystery. We close now. Close our contemplation of the shrine. Close our journey through its darkness. Close our standing at thresholds we have crossed in imagination but cannot cross in reality. We leave the shrine to its silence, to its burial, to its protection beneath earth that holds it until future generations perhaps will approach it again with new questions, new methods, new interpretations. And we carry with us what the shrine has given, not certainty, not complete understanding, not the lived experience we cannot possess, but something else. The recognition of human spiritual capacity, the testimony to faith's endurance, the evidence that 8,000 years ago people cared about more than survival, created space for mystery, built thresholds between ordinary and sacred, offered what was valuable to what was believed holy, honored their dead, maintained worship across generations, and left behind the traces that call to us still. The threshold we cannot cross, the boundary that remains, the division between past and present that no scholarship can eliminate, the mystery that persists, the shrine that waits, the Neolithic worshippers who believed, the faith we cannot share but can honor, the sacred space we cannot enter but can contemplate, the threshold, forever uncrossable, forever present, forever marking the boundary between the knowable and the unknowable, between the physical and the experiential, between the shrine as archaeological evidence and the shrine as lived religious reality. We stand at the threshold. We honor what we cannot cross. We acknowledge what we cannot know. And we sleep now, letting the shrine rest in its ancient darkness, letting the threshold mark the boundary we have approached but cannot pass, letting the mystery remain mysterious, letting the sacred remain sacred, letting the past remain past while we honor it from our present, while we carry forward the memory of the shrine at Köşkhöyük, where 8,000 years ago humans created sacred space and worshipped in darkness and left behind the stones and ash and bones that testify to their faith, to their devotion, to their humanity that reaches across millennia to touch our own, to remind us that we too stand at thresholds, we too seek the sacred, we too create meaning in the face of mystery, we too are the shrine's inheritors, we too honor what we cannot fully understand, standing forever at the threshold we cannot cross. Sleep now. Let the shrine rest. Let the threshold stand. Let the mystery endure. Forever.